First, the UN has warned the world is on track for what it calls a catastrophic 3.1 degrees Celsius of warming this century. The gap between the emissions cuts needed to limit global warming and the actual progress being made has been made clear in a new report. The UN Environment Programme says the world is currently on track for temperature rises between 2.6 and 3.1 degrees Celsius, depending on how much the currently promised climate action is delivered. Remember, countries agreed to pursue efforts to curb temperature rises to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels and well below 2 degrees. That was at the Paris climate talks back in 2015. Well, this warning comes ahead of this year's UN COP29 talks in Azerbaijan. Let's speak to our climate editor, Justin Rowlatt. Justin, just talk us through what this means.
Well, as you say, this is the emissions gap, the gap between emissions as they are now and the cuts that need to be made in order to keep climate change, as much under control as we can hope for. And as you say, what it's saying is that emissions aren't falling. In fact, they're rising. They rose by over 1% last year. So that's between 22 and 2023. And they say at the current trajectory, the current course we're on, as you say, would take us to an increase in temperatures by the end of the century of between 2.6 degrees and 3.1 degrees. Now, that would be an enormous impact on the world's climate system. Remember, back in 2015 at the Paris conference, the countries of the world agreed to try and keep the rise in global temperatures to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Now, scientists say there is no safe amount of climate change, but they say that 1.5 degree limit should avoid the worst effects of the droughts, the heat waves, the floods, the sea level rise, the collapse of ecosystems that we can expect from climate change. As you say, this warning comes ahead of the next big UN conference, which is going to be in Baku in Azerbaijan in a couple of weeks. And what the UN is saying, look, it isn't too late yet, but we're getting pretty close to that point, is what the UN is saying. And it's saying there needs to be a massive effort by all the countries of the world to ramp up their efforts to cut greenhouse gas emissions. But it says that needs to be led by the rich countries. The rich countries need to lead the way, and they need to begin doing that as soon as possible.
Well, let's talk a bit about the politics of it then. What's your assessment of where, especially those big rich countries, are on this?
Well, look, we're in an interesting moment. Renewable technologies have fallen in price over the last couple of decades in a way that nobody could have expected. So the tools, if you like, for moving away from fossil fuels are available to us in a way that perhaps we couldn't have imagined 20 years ago. What needs to happen is we need to start implementing that. We need to start investing in renewable technologies over oil and gas. And to a certain extent, that's happening. The UN estimates that twice as much money went into renewables last year than went into oil and gas. Sorry, that was the International Energy Agency, a kind of global watchdog on energy, came up with those figures. But this move to clean electricity needs to also be accompanied by a massive shift away from using fossil fuels to power the way we get around, to the way we heat and cool our homes, the way we power our industries, the way we power our cities. All of that needs to switch to electricity. So that is a huge kind of revolution in the way we do things that needs to be massively accelerated as well. And what the UN is saying is, look, this can be done and in fact could offer real opportunities to countries to build a new, cleaner industrial system that would bring jobs and wealth and prosperity to their countries. That's the kind of optimistic vision they hold out, but they say if this doesn't happen, then we could face, as you said, devastating climate change.
Justin, thank you so much for that. We're going to speak now to Professor Daniela Schmidt, an earth scientist at the University of Bristol. Thank you for coming on the programme.
You're very welcome.
So first of all, before we get into some of the measures and could you just outline what the world would look like if we have this warming of between 2.6 to 3.1 degrees Celsius? Just map it out for us.
It's becoming more and more complicated to then really project what's going to look like. We expect the real consequences for our ecosystems. So we're expecting extinctions. Most of our ocean would be at temperatures that never seen before in the lifetime of most of the organisms. We would be expecting floods, rainfalls. Those storms we have seen in the last months would become even stronger. And ultimately, we're expecting heats and floods to come together and droughts to come together to have real impacts on our ability to grow food for the planet.
OK, and what's going wrong in your eyes? Why are we potentially heading towards that kind of scenario?
As Justin just said, we have a huge amount of tools available for us to reduce our emissions and to also restore nature to help us draw down more of the CO2. The will isn't there. If you look at the national determined contribution, as Justin said, they are fixing us on a warming which we know is dangerous for us and the planet. And still, there's no will, no action to change housing, transport, and reduce emissions.
So is this politicians or is it industries? Who's at fault?
I think it's important to remember it's all of us who have to do something. But 3/4 of those emissions coming from 20 countries, from the G20 countries. So it's very clear that our way of living is putting a real, absolutely existential threat to many people in sub-Saharan Africa, in Southeast Asia, in Central America. So it's our way of living and our loss of reduction of emissions which is driving this.
Professor Daniela Schmidt, thank you very much for coming on the programme. Thank you.
You're welcome.